Why hello there and welcome to this Astranti bite-sized video. What you see in front of you right now is an extract from our F1 module on short-term investments and finance. Now, when it comes to raising finance for a business, there are different strategies that you can employ. And these strategies are important because they take into consideration your working capital needs, as well as things like your fixed assets. And the reason why you need to do this is because debt financing and the strategic nature of using debt finance to achieve your business objectives is an important part throughout your CIMA studies. You see it in F1, in F2, in F3, in the case study exams, and you might even see it in topics like P2, where you have to consider appraising different projects, and of course you may have to consider ways of raising finance for said projects. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the strategies you might want to consider when raising debt for your company. In a conservative approach then, the long-term finance will be used to finance all non-current assets, all permanent working capital, and some temporary working capital. Short-term finance then will finance the remainder of the temporary working capital that is not covered by the long-term finance. And we can visualize this using this chart. So what you can see is that if we look at this axis here, we can see that our long-term financing will cover our permanent working capital, non-current assets, and some of our temporary working capital represented by this dotted line. So this is the sum part of our long-term finance. Then the remainder of the temporary working capital, so the working capital that you could say goes above this line, is covered by short-term financing. Now, what is the reasoning for why a business may use short-term and long-term financing in this way? Well, let's go back to our example of Gorilla. By using this approach, Gorilla will instead use its short-term finance to finance seasonal peaks, so that when the temporary working capital goes above line, that is when you'll use short-term finance to fund the extra inventory that it needs that can't be covered by its long-term finance. And there are some pros and there are some cons to this approach. So pros being that provides a large amount of funds for management. So they have a large amount of funds available for working capital, meaning that there is little risk of the business actually running out of cash and being unable to make its payment obligations. Of course, by using long-term finance to cover the majority of the working capital in a business, that means that an entity like Gorilla will not have to pay back lenders for a longer period of time. And as a result, it can keep cash in the business for much longer. And of course, because of this longer payment period, this means that the interest rates are going to be higher because the investors are taking a higher risk by providing a long-term loan to Gorilla, as I mentioned a moment ago with the cost of borrowing. And lastly, because of all these factors, the conservative approach is actually quite expensive for a business due to the higher interest rates. And this is because the majority of its working capital is financed via long-term loans. We're going to move on to the second approach to financing, which is called the matching or moderate approach. You may see either, just understand they both mean the same thing. In a matching or moderate approach, long-term finance is used to finance non-current assets and all permanent working capital. But long-term finance is not used to finance any temporary working capital. Instead, short-term finance is used to finance all temporary working capital. So that's the difference. And this is illustrated using this chart again. This time, however, as you can see, our long-term finance covers permanent and non-current assets, but our short-term finance will cover the whole of the temporary working capital, but no more than that. Why this mixture? Why do we finance temporary working capital with short-term finance and permanent working capital with long-term finance? Well, an entity that uses the matching approach will seek to match the expected life of its assets to the expected life of the finance that it used to purchase them. So, for example, with temporary working capital, we expect this inventory to be sold very quickly, most certainly within the next 12 months, because it's temporary. It's above the permanent working capital, which is something we expect to remain constant year on year on year. So as a result, we match our short-term finance, which is also less than 12 months, to our temporary working capital, which is expected to be used up in under 12 months. Our permanent working capital then, and our non-current assets in particular, will use long-term finance because we expect to have our permanent working capital and our non-current assets for a much longer period of time, and we expect to pay off our long-term debt using the returns made from the exhaustion of our non-current assets and our permanent working capital. So how would Gorilla Limited use the matching approach? Well, in order to finance the extra inventory that it has to purchase as a result of its business with Wolf Accounting, it could use an overdraft facility. Alternatively, it could use a short-term loan to cover any cash flow shortages while they wait for payment. Again, these are temporary increases in working capital requirements, temporary changes in it, which require short-term finance. For the inventory that it generally has to meet average demand across the whole year, Gorilla Limited will use maybe long-term loans, long-term borrowings. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, to start with, you're balancing the risks and the costs of the appropriate type of investment to the appropriate type of finance. And this is going back to that what I've just said, which is that you're matching the expected life of your assets to the expected life of the funds. So short-term, temporary working capital, is matched to short-term finance. It is also less expensive because what are you doing? You're using more short-term finance to cover your working capital, your overall working capital, compared to conservative, where you're using your long-term to cover your permanent and temporary, some of your temporary working capital. But in matching, you're using short-term finance to cover all of your temporary working capital. So in that sense, it's less expensive than the conservative approach. And because of this idea that you're only allocating finance to the appropriate type of assets, the appropriate type of working capital, you're making sure that your risks are not too high, as with the conservative approach, where your risks are considerably higher due to the higher interest costs on long-term loans. Lastly then, a disadvantage of this approach is that because you're using more short-term finance, you then of course need to be able to have more short-term finance facilities available to you on short notice as and when you need them. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more like this, including marks, revision notes, and even question tutorials, you can head on over to the Astranti website, where we offer a full course that gives you access to this wide variety of materials, all in order to help you pass your exam. Now, if you'd also like to stay in contact with us and see more posts like this, you can subscribe to our social media channels, which include Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.